Here we are. Good evening, Cobalt Studios. Thanks very much for coming down for this fantastic, varied and super diverse event celebrating jazz. Is it jazz here at Cobalt Studios? I'm really thrilled to be here. Super excited. For those of you who don't know me, maybe some of you just saw me play a set with the excellent Anna McCoy on harp. But if you don't know who I am, my name's John Pope. I'm a double bass player, an improviser, composer, a band leader, and a working musician based here in Newcastle upon Tyne. This has been my stomping ground for more or less my whole adult life. And I've been involved in music in various forms, mostly in the sort of fringes of improvisation, jazz, and contemporary creative stuff. And I'm a frequent player here at Cobalt Studios in a whole variety of guises. I'm always thrilled to be here. It's always a fantastic place and a really vital part of this scene that I'm so proud to be a part of. And I have been invited by Kate as part of this night to run this little Q&A interview situation with our guest, promoter, agent, author, musician, anything else? Multi-hyphenates that you want to add into this? That'll do. André Marmot, who has written this fantastic book, Unapologetic Expression, which we're going to be talking about a little bit now. André, thanks very much for coming and joining us as part of this event.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I guess before we go any further, I just want to say a few things. Firstly, I want to say thank you to all of you for in advance for your attention. I mean, this is not only the furthest north that I've been to do one of these book events, but it's also the deepest into the weekend. These events are usually on a Wednesday or a Thursday. I've even done Friday night, but I tell you, I've done maybe 20 talks to promote this book and I've never done one on a Saturday night, so I hope it's going to be as exciting as one might expect from Saturday night entertainment. I also wanted to say this venue is really close to my heart. I've had the privilege of playing on this stage 3 times, I think, with my band Afriqua, which has nothing to do with jazz. It's an Afro-electronic project. I've even been in a video about Cobalt and why it's such an important venue and why grassroots venues are so important. So I really do feel this place with my heart. I've also had the privilege of eating Kay's food on numerous occasions, and yeah, big up that. In 2025, to have a venue that is truly independent, proper grassroots, where the owners personally cook for everyone, for the artists, and bring people in and just create such a warm and welcoming space is a really magical thing and intersects with the topic of the book in a bunch of ways that we'll probably come to. But yeah, before saying anything else, I just want to acknowledge the importance of this venue, what an incredible place it is, and how grateful I feel to be here. So thank you.
Have you ever been out on a Saturday night in Newcastle?
Do you know what? The 3 times that I've come to this city, I've come to Cobalt, and because I've come with my band, we've come in a van, we've parked outside, we've come here, we've done our sound check, we've eaten, we've played, we've partied, and we've gone to the hotel, and we've left. So I've actually never, the first time I'm still at Newcastle City Centre was arriving there today on the train. So no, the answer is no.
Well, at some point in your life, you should witness what the Diamond Strip is like. At some point on a Saturday night. That's a local reference for Newcastle heads. So let's move our attention to the book a little bit. Do you want to give us? The book is obviously about the UK jazz scene, the London-centric UK jazz scene that has exploded in popularity over the course of the last decade or so. Lots of incredible musicians coming out of this. Lots of really dynamic and sort of youthful, vibrant, energetic music happening, which has sort of really refreshed the awareness of a global audience to what UK jazz has to offer as a scene for creativity, which you go into in depth in the book, and also with, we'll get to it in a minute, that you have a whole load of interview subjects who are part of the scene as well. But one of the things that I really enjoyed as I was reading it, and this is to tee you up too strongly for it, but the fast show comes in for quite a kicking, which is quite a thing. For those of you, this is a young crowd, if I can reference the fast show and there's not an immediate laugh as reference to jazz, which I'm excited about. But do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of image problem that UK jazz might have had before this kind of explosion that is sort of personified in some of that slightly cartoony attitudes that that sort of are associated with that?
Yeah, I can definitely go into that. I mean, I guess for me, what's already exciting, like you just said, is you mentioned fast show, and maybe not everyone here even knows what you're talking about.
Who knows what I'm talking about when I talk about the fast show? So there's a few hands, but this is really, really fascinating that there's not an immediate like, oh yeah, the fast show. It was a sketch show in the 90s, and they had a long-running jazz club sketch where there was a sort of cartoon version of jazz presented every week. That's the context anyway for what we're talking about.
I mean, it's, in a way, like the fact that people haven't heard of it, it's like, okay, great, we don't even need to talk about that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? We can talk about the future. It's like, you know, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess, to be honest, if I was going to start with reading anything, the most appropriate thing for me feels, just to quote Femi Koliosa from Ezra Collective, because obviously Ezra, like, you know, I mean, I bet every single person in this room, young and old, knows Ezra Collective, right? Anyone not heard of Ezra Collective? Right. Yeah? Okay. Ezra. Oh, lying. You know, Ezra Collective, so I've got a 5-year-old daughter, and Ezra Collective were on what she calls Strictly, Strictly Come Dancing, but she didn't used to be able to say Strictly, so she said Strictly. She loves Strictly. And Ezra were on Strictly, and I was like, oh my god, that's Femi, who I know, you know what I mean? And I was like, yeah, I know that guy. And she was like, Daddy, you know him. Like, you know, the idea that like somehow jazz musicians who I know from like South London jazz scene have become like genuine international stars and like appearing on mainstream TV shows and, you know, winning Brit Awards and winning Mercury Prizes, like that. Hand for Ezra, man! Like amazing what they've achieved. To me, that's completely wild that we've got to this point. And you know, I guess what John is mentioning is the fact that like, when we were, you know, we're about the same age. Old, and like when we were growing up, like that wasn't the way that jazz was being thought of. Jazz was just not cool at all, and people were really trying to avoid it. And so the fact that like Ezra and this whole generation have managed to put jazz on the map as basically part of youth culture is just like an incredibly magical achievement. So yeah, my book is really about like sketching some of those routes and some of those pathways. Should I go with this Femi quote?
By all means, please, I'd love to hear it.
So yeah, I mean, right towards the end of the book, there's a bit where I interviewed, I should say I did 86 interviews for this book, and it was really important to me that people would speak in their own voices, you know, and have a chance to express themselves kind of unmediated by me. And so there's whole long chunks of quotes. So yeah, with that said, Femi Koliosa. The way to make sure the thing comes forward is stripping your ego out and making sure your mind is focused on the bigger picture. Jazz is bigger than Ezra Collective. Music is bigger than Femi. The drums is bigger than me. The future is more important than my present. It's all about how do I translate the greatness that I inherited from tomorrow's warriors, from uni, from school, from everything. How do I put that into people younger than me so that they can put that into people younger than them? That's what a legacy is. When I did Roundhouse with the Ezra Collective last year, I walked out and I saw a bunch of teenagers. And that gave me hope for the future. Because hipsters are fickle, man. When the next pair of shoes come out, they're all there. The other ones are getting thrown away.
Fantastic. I mean, there's something, There's something in that which I'm really interested in, which is particularly, legacy is one part of it, but then also there's a continuum aspect to being involved in this music.
Yeah.
Which I think is something that, especially when you're approaching it as an audience member, someone who reads magazines and someone who gets information sort of dropped on you through the internet, or as a student of the music, like those of us who've studied it in some way or another, or been involved in a scene for a long time, it can be easy to lose sight of the long front half of someone's journey. Yeah. By the time you hear about them, especially if it's someone as explosive as Ezra Collective or Dubaya Garcia or Shabaka Hutchins or any of these figures who seemingly kind of appeared out of nowhere with these fully formed ideas and really revolutionized the scene, it's easy to forget that they actually have a lineage before them, not just in terms of who they've learned from, but actual practical on-the-ground experience as players and students, you know. I mean, how important is that as part of this whole community? Yeah,
that's a great place to start. I mean, actually, the quote on the back of this book is from Courtney Pine, like, you know, probably the biggest British jazz musician of the 90s. And he says, the important thing to know is that it's a chain, and everybody in that chain is imperative to keeping this freedom of expression called jazz alive. You know, and a huge part of the story of this book is about the fact that actually it didn't come out of nowhere. You know, I think from about 2016, 17, you had like a lot of articles in The Guardian and a lot of the music mags and stuff like talking about this jazz as though it had come from, you know, absolutely nowhere, just sort of exploded, you know, a big bang sort of thing. But yeah, a big part of what my book is about lineage and about all of the things that laid the conditions for this amazing wave that we've witnessed. Cleveland Watkins, who was, again, like part of Courtney Pine's generation, one of the big sort of jazz vocalists of the 90s and beyond, and a very open-minded person who also did, you know, he did drum and bass vocals with DJ Markey and DJ Petit and these kind of people. You know, he was always experimenting, doing different stuff. He says, it's a continuum, and they built on what we laid. So they're able to travel and spread the British experience further and wider than we were able to. We weren't able to do that because of loads of reasons. The climate, the time that we were in. You didn't have Ryanair and all that kind of stuff back in the 80s, flying all over around Europe. Different times. I just see it as a loop. It's a continuum. And it should be respected that way as well. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a really big thing about the way that this generation just kind of came through. I mean, one big part of the story is Tomorrow's Warriors, who I don't know if anyone here knows what that is.
Put your hands up if you're familiar with Tomorrow's Warriors. Okay, so actually,
impressive amount of people, yeah.
Not too many folks are familiar with this as a notion. Do you want to explain?
But those who are, I mean, I'm intrigued. Like, shout out if you don't mind, just how you know about Tomorrow's Warriors.
My dad.
Your dad. What did your dad do?
My dad was a jazz musician.
Right, amazing. Was he part of the Warriors or?
Nah, but a lot of his friends were. So.
Okay. Who else knows about Tomorrow's Warriors? How do you know? Yeah.
I don't know. I have no idea. All over, like, yeah.
Like press kind of thing, or people talking about them, or.
So many brilliant musicians started their journey into jazz through what they do.
Yeah.
I guess with me reading about people's bios.
Reading bios and knowing about, yeah. Anybody else know about them for some other reason? Yeah?
I know about them because I knew Gary and Janine when they ran June Records.
Right.
And then sort of the progress into Tomorrow's Warriors. And yeah, I mean, just watching kind of all those people that have come through, a lot of people actually, not all have achieved what Ezra have, but, you know, an awful lot of them have achieved. And what Penny has said at the Brits and so on about a youth club, it's kind of a shorthand really, but it's about that way of learning that is really different from kind of a more formal sort of, you know, structure. And to me, that's really interesting, you know, kind of why is that different, and why does it kind of bring people like him and Sultan Stevenson who end up teaching for them because they see that, they pay back, and yeah, I think they're brilliant.
Yeah, Tomorrow's Warriors are really key. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, like to explain what Tomorrow's Warriors is or does, Tomorrow's Warriors basically is what you might call an NGO, like a kind of an organisation whose remit is to try to support young people to get into playing jazz, broadly speaking. But I think they very deliberately made a point of trying to privilege, like, trying to create pathways for people of colour, people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, women. Essentially, there was like a feeling that a lot of the more mainstream organisations like NIJO, National Youth Jazz Orchestra, and some of the other things were kind of more focused on, like, you know, privately educated white males basically, and their whole thing with Tomorrow's Warriors was creating a pathway for other people to have an opportunity to play jazz, and that in a way is kind of the start of this entire wave. I mean, you know, we were talking about this on the stairs before with our little pre-chat, is that like a lot of the musicians who you know, Ezra Collective and Moses Boyd, and that whole Nibai Vasir, all this generation who've become quite famous, a lot of them were listening to like grime and hip hop and R&B and drum bass and garage and basically all of the kind of urban music of London, as well as jazz. And that's part of the way. They weren't in this kind of like jazz silo, whereas a lot of people who've learned jazz from just like listening to 50s and 60s records and going to conservatoire and just going to jazz clubs don't necessarily have these other reference points at their disposal. So that's a huge thing, the idea that you've got all of these people who might have ended up becoming musicians, but they could have ended up being like grime artists or whatever.
Certainly, yeah.
You know, playing jazz.
I think my understanding of getting involved in the sort of continuum of playing this music has my entire career of it has been associated with meeting people who do it and talking to them. That's always been it. It's so much more an immediate in the room thing that you do when you meet other musicians. You speak, you chat about what you like. They recommend things to you. They turn you on to stuff. They kick your ass sometimes when you're not, ready to do stuff or whatever it might be. And that's a really kind of crucial part of doing it. It's very much an expression of being in that community sort of space. I mean, to speak a little bit about the impetus to write the book. I mean, what is it, as someone who had their feet sort of in that pond a little bit, what was it that gave you the spark to say, I'm going to write this book about this scene now? Like, what was it that kicked it off for you?
Well, that's a great question. I guess for me, there was a couple of different things. So till now, I work as a music agent and a musician. And within my agency, I was aware of this sort of like this thing bubbling up from South London, basically. I used to represent a band called United Vibrations, and that featured the drummer Yusuf Days, who was like 17, 18 at the time when I met him. It was him with two of his brothers, Kareem Days and Ahmed Days. Again, they were the children of the jazz musician as well. And Wayne Francis, who then went on to set up Steam Down and the Steam Down Orchestra. Steam Down was it still is a weekly club night in South East London, which is a real important incubator for the whole London scene. So I kind of knew these guys when they were really young, and I was kind of watching the scene develop. I talk about this in the book quite a bit, because people didn't know really, jazz was not, I can't stress enough how uncool jazz was in 2010, even 2011, 2012. I think people take for granted now that jazz is kind of cool, and everyone's like, oh yeah, jazz, I love jazz, Ezra Collective. You say anyone outside the music world, you say to them jazz, like, oh yeah, I love jazz, Ezra Collective. Do you know what I mean? Everyone knows Ezra, everyone kind of knows jazz now and feels like they like jazz, which is great. I don't say that in I think some people can be a bit sniffy about that, and that comes into the book as well. People go, oh, that's not real jazz. Oh, that's not interesting. For me, that is absolutely real jazz. And
sorry to put a pin in, because I think there's a really interesting passage. I remember reading this, and it really resonated with me in this place, and I have to come out a little bit and acknowledge the degree to which it's it's a slightly bitter pill to swallow sometimes as a musician when there's a very successful boom of something.
Yeah,
and you're part of it. Yeah. And you're not part of it. And you sort of say it at one point in the book about this kind of, there's a temptation to kind of give it this Emperor's New Clothes kind of sheen.
Emperor's New Jazz. Yeah.
Emperor's New Jazz. Yeah.
But actually, there's a bit from Shabaka as well where he says, sorry, meandering now, aren't we? He says, regardless of what anyone else, do you know Shabaka Hutchings from Comments Coming and Sons of Kemet? No, just Shabaka. He says, regardless of what anyone else says, jazz musicians are funny creatures. For so long they were saying, is jazz dead? Is it not? Trying to get audiences or a wider, more diverse audience. Then someone comes along that basically gets that audience for them. The streaming goes up, everything goes up. The scene gets revived because the media can put them in the magazines without them looking like anomalies. And everyone's going, oh no, they're not as innovative as they were back in the day. You can't have it both ways. This is something that a lot of older jazz musicians have a problem with. The humility of realising that even though some of the younger jazz scene might not have the attitudes that you think are important, there's always stuff to learn. Ezra, there is that enthusiasm that they're going to smash every single gig without fail and connect with the audience on an actual personal level, which you can't necessarily say about all types of jazz that might be more proficient if you're looking at it purely from an instrumental context. If they hadn't been given the opportunity at the point where people might have been saying, well, they've not earned this, then they wouldn't have got to the point where they are now. Sometimes you just got to give artists a show and reserve judgments until you've seen them after a couple of years. For me, the problem is if you see some artists and they're not going forward, it might be that the scene we call the UK jazz scene is actually going to mature fully in the next 5 years. But that might not have been possible without the touring that they've been doing in the last 5 years. You just never know what the historical trajectory is. I love that quote because this interview was conducted in 2020, right? 5 years ago. Yeah. And there's Shabaka talking about it might mature in 5 years. And then 5 years later, you've got Ezra Collective winning the Brit Awards, winning the Mercury Prize or whatever. It's now we're talking about a fully formed scene. But, when I was doing these interviews, it's you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But going back to just the Tomorrow's Warriors thing, which kind of haven't quite completed that little bit.
It's really easy to run off on these.
Yeah, but there's just we're trying to squeeze a lot of ideas into a short space of time, and as we said, Saturday night, keep it snappy. But the Tomorrow's Warriors thing is really important because they have had quite a lot of press, they have had quite a lot of credit for the work that they've done. But a lot of people who follow this scene, like some of you guys, know about Tomorrow's Warriors anyway. But what people don't necessarily know is about the link between Tomorrow's Warriors and the 90s and the 80s and the jazz scene, which, broad summary is that in the mid-80s you had this jazz boom in America kind of started by Wynton Marsalis and the so-called Young Lions, which is quite a kind of neoconservative approach to jazz and very much about claiming jazz an American art form. I guess the logic being like, well, black people made jazz, and jazz is the definitive American art form, therefore black people need to be respected as part of American society, which was an important fight for Marsalis and all that thing, and I really see the point of that. But on the other hand, it sort of created quite a like neoconservative idea about what jazz had to be, and the idea of jazz has to be rooted in swing and the blues and New Orleans and stuff. Anyway, so there was this kind of like jazz boom in America in the mid-80s, which then sort of, a bit like now, where you had, Kamasi Washington and the whole kind of boom in Glasgow and stuff. You had like a boom in America, and then shortly after a boom in the UK. These things are all connected. So you had like this Wynton Marsalis thing in the 80s, and then you had like Courtney Pine and Steve Williamson and Cleveland Watkins and Orphy Robertson, all those guys. Anyway, some of those guys came together to form basically a black big band. Because the feeling then, UK in the 80s, UK now is racist, but UK in the 80s was like an extremely racist place, in certain places especially. And so there was a feeling that black musicians were being excluded from orchestras, BBC concert orchestra, and the kind of like mainstream orchestras that a lot of people really needed to be into if you wanted to make a proper reliable living. So, and that was partly because of a stereotype belief that black musicians couldn't read music and wouldn't therefore not able to kind of read charts and stuff like that. So by the way, everything I'm telling you I got directly from the mouth of the people who started it, Claude Depper and Courtney Pine. And they were just saying that this was a thing that was bothering them. So they set up what was called the Jazz Warriors as basically a black big band. The idea being that it was a vehicle for black jazz musicians to play together in an orchestra setting, and it was always supposed to be a kind of revolving door, just a place for different. So in the end, like virtually every kind of important musician of colour from that period played in Jazz Warriors. But they became quite hype. But basically, the whole thing ended up kind of falling apart from the usual struggles around power and ego and women and everything else, right? But whereas a lot of people then went off and got their individual record deals with big American labels and stuff, a bit like is happening now. Gary Crosby, who was already a bit of an elder then, bass player, he then, with his partner Janine Irons, they set up Tomorrow's Warriors as a kind of vehicle to support new generations and to provide not only like jazz learning, but also to provide a kind of structure and to provide sort of like political and spiritual advice as well. And I stress this because in a way, it's not just that a lot of this new generation, Femi and Nabaya and Moses Boyd and all these people came through Tomorrow's Warriors. It was also that Tomorrow's Warriors was kind of a space where they could express themselves, not just musically, but like politically as well, which is, a huge theme in this book and also in this new jazz wave is like jazz as a vehicle for tackling racism and sexism, jazz as a vehicle of personal expression, jazz intersecting with politics, jazz talking about Grenfell, jazz talking about domestic politics, etc. So that's really, really important, like the space that was created by Tomorrow's Warriors for these musicians to kind of find their feet politically and spiritually, and that also then kind of links back to this whole long tradition of jazz as a form of rebellion, as a form of political music, as a form of community music, which I think had been really lost in lots of ways.
It really reminds me, we sort of said this again on the stairs when we were having our little sort of pre-chat. It was a nice little chat, it was lovely. It was nice to get a chance to do that and then to repeat it here. There was a lot of, it gets mentioned a few times in the book, so some of the parallels between things like Tomorrow's Warriors and then I mentioned the AACM in Chicago, which is the Advancement for the Association of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, was a Chicago-based organization of avant-garde African-American artists who were determined to make spaces for their music, which was radically different from what was perceived as the sort of mainstream of jazz at the time. To the degree, and again, absolutely rife with structural racism and the sort of situations that completely exclude musicians from any sort of mainstream discussion, to the degree that so many of them eventually left the United States and moved to Europe and started working in those situations. But when I look at organizations like the ACM, like Tomorrow's Warriors, like the sort of collective spirit that sort of forms in a lot of these communities, it makes me think immediately of kind of self-determined radical politics in that kind of way that is, it's inherently sort of pushing away a governing top-down idea of how you're going to do what you do. And I think some of the areas where this causes a little bit of friction, presumably in the scene, or a little bit of that kind of, that sparking kind of energy, is when it rubs up against things like like educational institutions where you go and learn, no shade on the people who come out of conservatoires at all. Those places are incredible proving grounds, and some amazing musicians are associated with them as teachers and as musicians. But I imagine being in a scene where you have a bunch of kids coming out of Trinity or Guildhall or something like that. And then on the other hand, you have a bunch of kids coming out of Tomorrow's Warriors and putting their own nights on and really sort of celebrating culture around immediacy, as opposed to a sort of pedagogical and sort of museum piece idea of how to learn the music. Like, I imagine there's a real friction in that.
Well, totally, but I mean, in a way, that's what was so cool about this wave, was that it wasn't like a bunch of kids coming out of conservatoire and a bunch of kids coming out of Tomorrow's Warriors. Like, they were the same people.
Right,
I mean, I think that, again, a lot of the kind of the musicians of the black musicians of the 80s who I interviewed were all like, yeah, we couldn't go to music colleges because we were working class and we were not, for whatever reason. And even if we did go, we ended up just feeling like, Cleveland Watkins was really hot on this. He was just like, people were not talking about jazz as being a black art form at all. It's like, how can you go to university level course and it not be mentioned that jazz has black origins? So, do you know what I mean? It's like, it's one thing to get people into a university, it's another to actually make the way that things are talked about diverse or whatever. Anyway, but the interesting thing was, again, like partly thanks to, Gary Crosby was very good friends with a guy whose name I completely forget, who was the director of Trinity Jazz Course at the time. And they were good mates, and so there was a bit of a pathway, and Gary would kind of put people forward, or he would help people to pass the exams or whatever. Basically, people like, Nabaya, Femi, Moses Boyd, Oscar Jerome, a bunch of these people all went to this jazz course at Trinity. Simon? Again? Simon Purcell, thank you.
Thank you, Ross.
Like a bunch of these people all went to that course, and so what was so interesting with this generation is that you had a bunch of people who were kind of like conservatoire schooled, had all of the like jazz history, all of those reference points at their disposal, but we're also listening to Stormzy, and we're also listening to Dizzy, and we're also listening to Rascal, not Gillespie, but also Gillespie. Do you know what I mean? It's just like.
Do you think there's something? I'm kind of pulling this out of thin air as I talk, so feel free to tell me I'm talking shite. But do you think there's something in the UK? I don't want to say versus, but sort of as opposed to or sort of against in respect with the American sort of approach. The Wynton Marsalis thing, Wynton comes forward and says this music is American classical music. It's thoroughly American. It's been designed the way that it is, and we're presenting it as a sort of pure form, which doesn't dilute its kind of immediacy, but does kind of put a sort of ring around it as a thing that you learn. Whereas from my perspective, certainly, I feel like one of the really fascinating things about UK jazz musicians is that we don't tend to get into jazz first. It's almost always that you get excited about music and maybe start investigating another form of music. I don't know if this is the case for the other musicians in the room, but certainly I was really into rock music and prog and all these different kinds of guitar-driven music when I was a teenager, because that's what was available to me and shown to me. And as I got into the bass, I then discovered jazz off being into the bass. Yeah. So all of the stuff that I'm about kind of has that information in it. And certainly, like, I think, sort of 10, 15 years ago, we talked about this again, there was a sort of a mini bubble, almost the same degree of like a cool jazz wave, where bands like Polar Bear and Acoustic Ladyland and this kind of indie rock flecked jazz thing was happening.
Who absolutely nobody here under 40 will have heard of.
No, right? Of course, right? But like, seriously, you couldn't open The Guardian in 2012 or whatever it was without hearing about a band with Sarah Rochford in it, right? And this whole scene was right on the verge of cool, but on the verge of cool. But it never quite accepted the jazz label in a way that wasn't a little bit sort of distant, right? Yeah. Whereas I think for this generation, they are doing that entirely, grasping capital J jazz as an aspect of what they do. But still with that kind of UK melting pot kind of aspect, they're bringing in all this other stuff, all this kind of UK bass culture, reggae, drum and bass, rave stuff that is part of their sort of scene. If you're coming up as a young person in that place, you're going to hear that music, you're going to socialise in this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting topic. I think the difference between the UK scene and the American scene. I mean, one of the things is that, like, from an American perspective, I think Americans would like to talk about all local jazz scenes as some sort of a spin-off of an American music. I guess the American narrative is jazz is the definitive American art form, and you can have jazz in Turkey or Denmark or the UK or France or Italy or anywhere else, but it's people from that country basically paying homage to an American art form. right? But that's not how I see it, and that's not. I mean, one of the things that really helped me unlock this way of thinking was Paul Gilroy, kind of like mid-90s theorist, I guess, and he wrote a book called The Black Atlantic. I think it was about 93, 94, where he talks about what he calls a unity of Afro-diasporic cultures, and his idea is basically that like anywhere in the world where essentially like black people have intersected with other cultures, there's kind of like a unity of those types of music that often have more in common with each other than they do with other art forms in those countries and stuff. So, you know, you might include like Brazilian samba or forró, but you might also include like French hip hop, and you might include a lot of the, you know, you'd probably include reggae and garage, you might include disco, like all these different genres which are kind of unified by essentially like the fact that they are from the intersection, broadly speaking, of like African creativity, black creativity, and other forms, you know. And so I think if you see it from that perspective, then instead of thinking about this particular UK wave as like a little island UK offshoot of an American art form, you actually I more see jazz as part of an all jazz, including this, you know, so-called like jazz, like 50s and 60s or 20s and 30s, depending what you're into, like American jazz, as just being an example of kind of a black and Afro-diasporic culture. Because if you think about what's really powered this UK wave, as well, and there's a lot of politics stuff which we, you know, haven't got into and maybe won't have time to get into, but as well as like Tomorrow's Warriors and all those kind of things, there's just like demographic things. You know, obviously you had the Windrush, whole generation of people from the Caribbean in the 50s and 60s who came to the UK and really changed the demographic makeup of the UK, but massively changed the cultural makeup of the UK. That wave of Caribbean immigration, and then in the 90s you had a huge wave of West African immigration, especially. So like Femi, Nigerian, Moses, Caribbean, Nubaya, like half Guyana, half Jamaican, something like that. They basically, most of the musicians of this wave have either some West African or some Caribbean heritage, bit of East African as well, Mark Vima as well. But there's like, you know, these people have come in, like, listening to, you know, you might be listening to like High Life at home, or you might be hearing Calypso at home, or you might be hearing reggae and dub at home, alongside like jazz and American soul and probably 90s hip hop and whatever else. But then you might also be listening to like grime with your mates at school, and all of these things have like, and then you're going to Tomorrow's Warriors and getting like an education in like jazz standards, and like all of these things have fed in a really organic and beautiful way to this new wave of UK jazz.
And I think there's a generational aspect happening here just in the education too, because, you know, Orphy Robinson talks in the book about coming up playing in reggae bands and being part of a scene who delivered that music as much as his interest in jazz is sort of shaping his instrumental.
And Brit Funk and Lovers
Roy
Rock
Funk and Incognito and all this kind of bits and pieces of stuff that are also happening. And it made me think a bit of, I don't want to talk too much about other authors because we're here to talk about your book, but there's a fantastic book by the great American NPR jazz radio critic Nate Chinnan called Making Changes, I think it's called. I think it's called that.
It's like that, is it?
Is it not Making Changes?
Playing Changes.
Playing Changes, you are right, entirely that. So this is a fantastic
book. It's a wicked book, yeah.
It's a really, really beautiful book, which is all about sort of the American side of this coin to a degree. And in that book, he makes a claim that we're living in effectively another golden age for jazz right now because of the level of diversity that falls under the umbrella, which I think is really great. And one of my favorite chapters in that book is he talks about the elders, which for American musicians now, or people who are steeped in the American jazz tradition, are people like, well, who's no longer with us, but Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, Anthony Braxton, who's touring, yeah. Like people who are now in their 80s, but who, when they were vital young musicians, were part of an avant-garde wave, right? So the people who are at the sort of, you know, at the authorial peak of the music that you're making, are going to shape what else you're seeing. And I guess for the young musicians who are coming through Tomorrow's Warriors in this era, people like Orphy Robinson, Jason Yard, Steve Williamson, all these folks who actually have a grounding in the practice of jazz as a sort of as a process, but then also the diasporic soaking of being into all these other musics, like that's there. It's
Yeah.
right there in the makeup of how they understand the music from the beginning.
For sure, but then when I was talking to, like I said, I interviewed all of these people, and actually, like, the names that were coming up from people like Femi and Moses and all those people, they were talking about John Boyega and Eric Badu and Stormzy, and they weren't so much talking about people in the jazz. But Moses was talking about John Boyega as like a really good example of, kind of like Black British excellence that has to go to America to eat. That was the way he described it, as in like he was talking about how we in the UK and like Black British people in the UK need to back each other. Like Cordy Pine and Omar, the soul singer, Omar Lightfoot, both were telling me how we don't rate. They were like, we don't rate each other in the Black community. We're like, they're both from like Harlesden or Wilson or something like that, Northwest London. And they were like, we never even thought of having to play with each other because like we don't. Yeah, but on that. Sorry, you said something really interesting. Yeah, sorry about Nate Chinnon's book, what you just mentioned. There's actually one bit in that book that struck out to me the most, which is where he talks about Kamasi Washington as being...
I was going to wonder if you were going to bring the Kamasi.
Yeah, well, he says this amazing thing, Nate Chinnon, in that book, where he talks about Kamasi as being a rare example of a major arrival in jazz who brings no structural innovation to his instrument, something like that.
Okay, right.
And I thought that was so interesting, and this is actually so hyper relevant for this whole scene and this whole way of how people are thinking about jazz. I mean, it goes back to that thing that Shabaka was just talking about in the quote that I read, where he's just like, oh yeah, the older generation don't rate this stuff because they don't think it's interesting, they don't think it's innovative. It was like this idea that you can be a major arrival in jazz without bringing any important structural innovation. Because again, before this way, like, no one's saying it now. No one would dare to say it now about Ezra. But the number of times, even people I was interviewing for the book were like, oh yeah, Ezra Collective, just boring, just sounds like 90s acid jazz. Like 10 different people told me that. Literally 10 different people said that Ezra just sounds like 90s acid jazz, right? And I wasn't even arguing with them. It's like, like I said, I kind of admit late on in the book about being like, oh yeah, in my head for a while I was like, I called it Empress New Jazz. Because like, it's not, but for me, and this is like so central to the whole meaning of the scene, really what my book's about is it's like, if somebody invites you to their house for dinner and you turn up and they cook you like a beautiful meal of real like handmade food made with love and it's delicious and the conversation's delicious and the wine is good and you're having a great time or whatever. And then the next day you're like, oh, how was dinner at those people's house? And you're like, oh, it was nothing I've never tasted before. Do you know what I mean? It's like, that isn't what it's about. And if you're constantly looking for like something like radically different and new, then, you're going to be hard to please and you're not necessarily going to enjoy your life that much, right? And like, in a way, I say that because for me, what's so important about this scene is essentially like, they've basically managed to take something that in some ways has been done before, but like renovate it and do it with love and do it with energy and do it with humility and do it with joy, I mean, Ezra's stuff is, Ezra's such a good example because it's so much about joy and dancing and it's so accessible. And like, I mean, it's funny, that tune, the one that was on Strictly Come Dancing, the one about, God gave me feet for dancing, that one. Yeah. So I realised at some point, I was like, why do I know that? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm up all night to get lucky. I'm up all night to get lucky. God gave me feet for... And you're like, wait a minute. This most popular tune that they've done is literally exactly the same melody as like what was a big hit by Chic and Pharrell, right? Like 10 years before.
Daft Punk.
Daft Punk and Nile Rodgers is on that. But yeah, like 10 years before, you've just had like a big pop hit, and you're like, wait a minute. I'm not saying that Ezra deliberately copied that. Like, I don't think they even noticed. Oh, fuck, did do that, didn't he? You know what I mean?
What is it they say, like, great artists steal and mediocre artists copy? I can't remember exactly what it is.
Something about, I think, my guitar teacher used to say to me, if you copy one person, it's plagiarism. If you copy 5 people, it's research.
Right,
like,
okay.
The point here is like, for me, it's like, if you go to somebody's house and they serve you all this amazing food with love, and then you're bitching to other people about how it wasn't that original, like, you're really missing the point and you're a bad dinner guest.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is interesting as well because it's about unpicking what the purpose of doing it for the people who are doing it kind of is, right?
Yeah.
Like
community, right?
Yeah. If you want to talk about innovation and you want to talk about sort of avant-garde stretching and process, like to go back to the ACM thing, you're talking about a bunch of musicians who are facing a really gate-kept musical community where what they're expected to provide is mainstream jazz that entertains people in a very strict way. Or bebop, right? You want to talk about bebop in the 1940s. Like, this is a music which at the point in the 1930s, most mainstream, aka white audiences in America who were consuming jazz swing music were consuming it in the form of a very, very widely entertaining and polished entertainment product that was very slick, very for show, and not particularly intellectual, big air quotes, right? So the idea suddenly comes along. It's like, okay, well, if we're going to make our music for us, our music is about precision, and it's about intellectualism, and it's about mastery, and it's about showing you something that is particularly this. It's an expression of a resistance to some degree, right? So also, you flash forward 80 years from there, or whatever it is, 60
That becomes a new orthodoxy.
It becomes an orthodoxy which stays in place, and the new resistance becomes about community and togetherness.
Yeah,
dancing,
is that also bringing you back to like the whole history of jazz? And again, this is what's been so beautiful about this wave for me, is that there's a real through line of a lineage of like jazz as a music of rebellion, jazz as a music of political expression, but also jazz as a music of joy, jazz as a music for dancing, jazz as a music for community. And, I think that's what's been so incredible about this new generation, is the way that they've brought jazz back to those roots. They've brought that back into jazz. And like I say, it's there's always going to be space for people pushing the avant-garde. There's always going to be room for that. But what's really funny is on the way here, I got a train up from London today, and then I got an Uber from the hotel to here. And the guy had noticed I had like two big bags full of books. Come to that later.
We'll come to that later.
He was like, "Oh, what are you doing at the venue?" And I said, "Oh, I'm giving a talk." And he was like, "Oh, about what?" And I said, "Oh, it's about jazz." And he was like, "Jazz? I'm a musician." Anyway, we got talking. It turned out that the Uber driver was a musician, and he told me this joke just as we were leaving, which was actually really, really relevant. He said, "What's the difference between a jazz musician and a rock musician?" He says, "A rock musician can play 3 chords to 3,000 people, and the jazz musician can play 3,000 chords to 3 people." That's literally the taxi driver on the way here told me that, and it was like, it's kind of weirdly relevant to what we're talking about, because it's just like, actually that cliche, Ezra have manifestly shown that to be not true, and yet many people would be like, "Oh, but they only do play 3 chords. It's the minor ninth and a." Do you know what I mean?
But the presence of the kind of the celebration and the activity of doing it is such a resistance, right? I mean, we don't necessarily have time to get really deep into the politics of it, but I'm really fascinated by the idea that being celebratory together in a space like that is a resistive act, right? It's an act of standing against these kind of notions of political structure that is supposed to keep us apart from one another, keep us from working together, and that kind of pushes through that. And it's sort of, in some ways, what I find really fascinating about this is a figure like Shabaka, right? Because Shabaka is able to kind of do both. Yeah. Shabaka is able to make you, to really make you dance, and then also to kind of flat out say, the UK is fundamentally racist in these very explicit ways. There it is in your face. And not back down from it, but you're still looking at it and going, yeah, you're there, you're bouncing while you're looking at that and really engaging with that message, right?
Funny you said it, because I was literally just about to, your thing called to mind a quote by Shabaka, which is just my British fallen open on it. Here he is, yeah. Shabaka says, "We like to call certain parts of life political, but in some ways, everything's a political point. In the end, all the music adds up to give you a tapestry of what the landscape is, as opposed to some music being more valid because it's giving a certain perspective, which might be one of struggle against depression. It all exists as one whole." And I think that's so important when you're thinking about this wave. There's like so many. There's a whole chapter called "Wake for Grenfell," which is about, I guess, how this new wave intersects with like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Grenfell, the kind of condemn government from 2011 onwards, and like all of the changes in UK politics and how all this, because for me, in a way, this book's not even about jazz, right? It's about UK, it's about politics, it's about migration, it's about racism, it's about identity, it's about social media, it's about all those things, and jazz is kind of just like a lens to talk about it. But this way that this wave of jazz kind of sits inside this sort of the changes in UK politics is like, for me, totally fascinating. But also it caused me to think a lot about how music can be political, the different ways in which music can be political. And you don't have to be like Abbey Lincoln style, like very direct vocal talking about things to, Cordy Pine was just like, you don't have to have words for me to be like, that sounds like a riot. It's just actually music in its way can affect, the different, like obviously jazz has a history of, in the civil rights movement in America in the 60s and the 50s of just, the way that music can just like catch a moment and amplify it. Really interesting. Man, we've taken up a lot of people's attention on Saturday night, eh?
We really have on a Saturday night. Before we're going to very quickly move on. Before I just open the floor, maybe we've got time to take 1 or 2 questions before we wrap up and let you get on with some fantastic music. But I should say that the book Unapologetic Expression is for sale. André has copies with him that I signed.
They aren't signed yet, but I will sign them for
They will
you.
be
I'm just
signed.
going to tell you on a like genuinely. I know this sounds like a marketing ploy, but I'm going to tell you at a genuine level, right? I have to buy the books from my publisher. I could have, if I was sensible, got them delivered here, but I didn't have the presence of mind to do that. So I carried 2 whole carrier bags of books all the way up from London, and I would be incredibly grateful if I don't have to carry them home. So if anyone
I
does,
got a double bass on the train from Birmingham the other day, so you know, fine.
so that as well, yeah. Double bass is also for sale. If you can't afford a double bass,
Please, I need to eat.
but yeah, for real, I will happily write you a personal message. I will dedicate it to you or your partner or your grandma or your child or anybody else. I'll be sitting here. I think Jacob's going to help me with the card reader. So yeah, if anyone does want to buy a book, I'll be really, really happy. There are not many copies left of the hardback. So yeah, if anyone does want to get one, I'll be incredibly happy about
It's
it.
a really fascinating book and a great read for anyone interested in this topic. Do we have like let's take 1 or 2 questions just as we go. Yes, please, right here in front.
Hi. I mean, like, I don't have a lot of experience in the music industry, but I've always thought of creating music as an introspective act. But in jazz and punk as well, which is like a weird one, is like a symptom of cultural revolution, of a shift in collective subconscious. And it's like whenever there's a big shift in political ideology or just even the way people think about things, these movements tend to rise a lot more. And I wanted to know, do you guys feel that is like an introspective process that everyone just kind of shares randomly? Or is that something more to that? I don't know. Yeah.
Can we have a round of applause for that question? I think it's an amazing question.
That's a really deep question. That's super deep. I think there's for musicians certainly. I think you live in a weird hinterland where you're very introspective and solitary as a practicer, right? But then when you go out and you actually make music, you can't live in that headspace. You have to live in a connected and very momentary headspace, which I think as an artist in general, whatever your medium of practice is, you're always trying to kind of locate some sense of intuition and some sense of momentary kind of connection with what you're doing. But you've kind of got no choice but to do that when you're an improviser, certainly. Like that's kind of how the whole thing works, full stop. On a political level, I think, I don't know, it's huge. It's huge. It's really interesting that people would go through the things that they're going and then get together and express it in this collective kind of way. And again, like we won't take up too much time, but I think there's a real model in that. You know, I think political organization could really take, in whatever form that means, could really take a lot from some of these artistic practices, be it like DIY punk subculture and or jazz. And they are really linked. Like I'll talk for hours about how certainly the kind of black avant-garde in the 60s, 70s is basically punk, right? It's basically punk rock. And that becomes the same in New York in the 90s when people are playing in the Knitting Factory and there are hardcore bands playing with free improv musicians and it doesn't sound wrong because they're the same music. It's the same present expression of a thing that's momentary and really fucking pissed off. So there you go.
I mean, I feel like you touched upon a general really interesting thing, which is that like 95% of the musicians that I know would probably describe themselves as kind of introverts, you know, and like same with writers, right? To be a musician or a writer, you have to spend a lot of time by yourself just working on your craft and doing your thing. And yet kind of like paradoxically, you also have to spend quite a lot of time like being a public person, you know, being on a stage in front of a load of people. And, you know, I'm always, as somebody who's kind of often behind the scenes as well as in front of them, it's like always astounding to me the difference. You know, Kay and I were talking about Henge, this like sort of psy rave band that I represent, and like how they, you know, on stage there's just like crazy alien persona, and then like backstage like the calmest, most well organized, just like nice people that you would ever imagine. And it's like, I think that difference between inside outside, and you know, I think as a musician, for me, it's about finding that sweet spot, because like you have to be listening to the world, you have to be aware of what's going on with the world, politics and just like currents, zeitgeist. You have to be part of that conversation, otherwise you're kind of irrelevant. And yet you also need to spend a lot of time working on your craft and developing your thing, otherwise you're only just reflecting what's going on in some more spongy way. So I think for for me, that kind of productive tension between being part of the zeitgeist and just being in your room working on your shit is what being a musician or any kind of artist is all about, really.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. We've got time for one more very fast one if anyone's got one. Hands up if you've got one. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
How do you kind of like, I guess Pleasure talks about like you've done some athletes so forth, how do you kind of like keep your working class people coming in with there's almost it's a tap on resources at the same time, so how do you kind of like keep appealing to those people, I guess?
appealing to those people or supporting those people?
Yes, boy.
Because I mean, there's a section, the last section of my book is called Because the End is Really the Beginning, and it's kind of talking about not only what's led to this point, but where it might go. And that's what, you know, that nice quote about from Femi about looking to the future and stripping your ego out of it and carrying on, paying it forward is really interesting, thinking about the way. So there's quite a lot of, I guess, you know, sort of low-level Marxist analysis of like the material conditions that support these things. I mean, you know, there's stuff about, but for me, basically, it's about support at a governmental level. I mean, like, obviously music education has been like ripped out of British culture, and if it wasn't for people like Tomorrow's Warriors, there would be very, very, very few opportunities for anyone to learn music in school. And if you're not learning it in school, or at least in state school, then that means that you're relying on basically being from a middle-class family and being supported to have private music lessons or to have an instrument bought for you, etc., etc., etc. So, I mean, for me, it's about organisations like Tomorrow's Warriors everywhere else. I mean, I did a talk in Liverpool a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of what was coming to me in the questions, people were just like, there's nothing like that here. We need that here, but it doesn't exist. I don't really know what exists in Newcastle or in this region. I mean, I know that there's sort of, you've got your old-fashioned kind of like big brass band competitions and stuff like that, which I know that Shabaka grew up taking part of in the Midlands, you know. But like, I don't really know what there is.
There used to be more of a further education and higher education scene for jazz education here in Newcastle, but it has moved institutions and then slowly kind of frittered away over the course of the last 15 years that I've been here. I don't know what the immediate answer is apart from try and pressurize. You know, I think it's a huge issue. I was talking to Manon, who was playing harp earlier, about the ways in which the UK government especially has marginalised our presence as artists as a social, like, you know, status, effectively. You know, if you're an artist, that you're a hobbyist as far as the UK government is concerned, regardless of what level you operate at.
Yeah, although ironically, it's so like, I remember with the whole Brexit thing, you know, Boris Johnson kept going on about fishing, right? And it was all these subsidies for fishing. And I looked up the thing, and it's like, the music industry is like 20 or 50 times as big as the fishing industry or something. It's a way bigger export. And yet he was talking about fishing and what the, you know, and it's like, actually music is this huge cultural export that the UK can be like incredibly proud of, and yet it doesn't really get the support that it needs at all.
No.
So yeah, I don't know, for me, like, kind of old-fashioned leftist perspective would just be like, you need the government to step up and put proper protections in and put proper money behind things. And yeah, I mean, I think basically for working class people coming into it, you just need pathways within like mainstream state education and more funding for it. It's such an obvious thing to say, but to me it's still kind of the truth, right?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so very much, Andre, for coming and sharing this journey with us. Please put your hands together for André Marmot.
Also big up to John for like, as a musician myself, I know how hard it is after playing a gig. All I ever want to do is go and smoke and just chill and not talk to anyone for at least an hour. So the idea of finishing a gig, taking a 5-minute break, and then actually interviewing someone about a book, respect, man, that was amazing.
I'll talk for hours if you let me. YouTube thanks. We're going to break this down and then we're going to get Mook and Tet are going to get up and play some fantastic spiritual jazz from the lead scene, and then following that, Jinjay, and there's going to be club night afterwards. It's going to be absolutely banging. But thank you so very much, Cobalt, for having us, for hosting this fantastic event. Andrew, see you next time.
Yeah, okay. And yeah, just to restate a couple of things. I think the venue offered to anyone wants to buy a book but don't want to like hold it throughout the night, you can buy a book and leave it at the door, and they'll hold it for you for free. Also, you can get a book from me now here, but you can also buy one at the door and then bring it to me to sign if you want to.
There you are. Definitely pick up a copy for further your understanding of this. André Marmot, thank you so much, man.